Hey guys, today we'll be taking a look at the 2022 governor elections and how the races are going for both parties in the competitive states, because in the end, these governor elections are going to matter a lot more than those Senate races. Governors can simply do a lot more for the people in their state than a single U.S. senator can, and so looking at these 9 toss-up races, they will have a major impact as to how Americans will be governed for the next 4 years. And of course, Democrats have not had more governors than Republicans since all the way back in 2010. And so right now, they are trying to win back the majority of governors, even though Democrats do govern more people overall. They currently only control 22 governorships, but 2022 is turning out to be a much better year than they had previously expected. And a major sign of this is that Democrats are now ahead by 0.5% nationwide against Republicans, according to generic ballot polling. Looking at the overall spread here, Democrats have led in basically most of the polls that have been released since August has begun. Even many of the polls in late July show Democrats leading significantly over Republicans, and their lead has only been growing since they took back the advantage here a couple of weeks ago. And if you look at the overall trend, Democrats have not been ahead in the generic ballot since all the way back in November of last year. And so in this video, we'll be taking a look at the 9 competitive gubernatorial elections and how both parties are doing in each of these races, because all 9 of these races could realistically go to both parties, but one party does seem to have a clear edge in most of these states. And so I'm actually going to start off with the Midwest, the 3 races in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. The Midwest is one of the most contentious regions in the country, and these 3 races are going to have a determining factor in how laws are passed in the next 4 years. Many of these states have Republican-controlled legislatures, and if a Republican governor is elected, abortion laws could change significantly. Right now, abortion protections do exist for citizens in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota, but that could definitely change if Republicans take power in the governor's mansion. And so Michigan is actually a likely Democratic state. That is just how well Gretchen Whitmer is doing right now. According to 538, she has a 95% chance at winning. I don't think it's going to be this much of a landslide for Whitmer, but Tudor Dixon is not well known of a candidate at all, and she only won the nomination because James Craig was disqualified. So Whitmer is pretty much on track to pretty easily winning her re-election, maybe by double digits, but I don't think that it will be as strong of a margin as 538 says it will be. And so looking at these 3 races, I'm going to start off with Minnesota. We have the election between Tim Walz and Scott Jensen. Jensen is a former member of the Minnesota State Senate, and Tim Walz was, of course, first elected in 2018 by a double-digit margin. The polls, though, for this race this year do suggest a much closer election between Walz and Jensen. Tim Walz, on average, leads by around 3 to 4%. However, the most recent poll conducted by the Scott Jensen campaign, this was an internal poll, actually puts Walz ahead by 4%. Now, even though the polls may suggest a stronger margin of victory for Tim Walz, I think realistically he's only going to win by 2 to 3%, much weaker than the 10% margin that he had over Jeff Johnson 4 years ago. And this is mainly because even though Democrats are leading in the generic ballot, if you look at the generic ballot in 2018, Democrats were up by 8.6%. So a significant difference. Even though Democrats are doing well right now, they were doing much, much better 4 years ago. And so that is why Minnesota is only going to be a lean state on our map. Next up, in Wisconsin, Tony Evers is running for his re-election. He was first elected in 2018, defeating 2-term incumbent Scott Walker. Walker was running for his 3rd term, so Evers' flip in 2018 was a major victory for the Democratic Party, and in 2022, Tim Michels is the Republican nominee. He narrowly defeated Rebecca Kleefisch, the former lieutenant governor. I think that Kleefisch would have been a better nominee. She is much more moderate than Michels. Michels did gain the endorsement of Donald Trump, but compared to many other Republican nominees across the country, like Herschel Walker in Georgia on the Senate level, Blake Masters in Arizona, Tim Michels is much more moderate and less pro-Trump compared to those candidates. So Tim Michels is an electable candidate for the GOP. I think that he is somebody that can make this race very competitive, but Tony Evers is also a pretty popular governor, and if you look at the latest poll, he does lead by 7%. Now, Tony Evers would make history if he were to win his a second term this November. The last time that a Democrat has won any Wisconsin gubernatorial election with a Democratic president in the White House was all the way back in 1962 when JFK was still the U.S. president. And so if we look at the 538 forecast for this race, Tony Evers is doing surprisingly well. I think the 538 is grossly overestimating the Democrats in this race. The forecast here gives Evers a 79% chance at victory. Now, the odds have gone up significantly for Evers over just the last couple of months, but really, he does not have an 8 in 10 chance at winning. I think that a 6 in 10 chance would be much more reasonable for the Democrats. Yes, Tony Evers is doing well, but 2022 is not going to be anything like 2018. You cannot just expect Democrats to outperform expectations because honestly, Democrats are probably going to do a lot worse than what any polling may suggest. But right now, I do still have this race for Tony Evers. I think that he can win his re-election, but I think that it will be a margin very similar to the one in 2018, which was 1.1%. So I have the state of Wisconsin as a tilt Democratic state right now, but I do think that Tony Evers has a slight edge. And moving on to Pennsylvania, we have the election between Josh Shapiro and Doug Mastriano, and I will just tell you right now, Mastriano is not going to be the next governor of Pennsylvania. He simply is just way too extreme of a candidate. In 2018, Tom Wolf was reelected to a second term against Scott Wagner by a 17-point margin, one of the most solid races for the Democratic Party. In 2022, we're going to see a much closer race, but one that Democrats are going to come out on top in. Shapiro was recently nominated by the Democratic Party, and Doug Mastriano is a candidate that the GOP Governors Association even refuses to endorse. The Republican Party is basically giving up on this race. According to the 538 forecast, Democrats have an 85% chance at winning, and this is the issue that I have with this forecast. I mean, Wisconsin, 79% chance that Tony Evers wins. Pennsylvania is only at 85 for Josh Shapiro. I mean, that simply is unrealistic. We have two very different elections in these two states. In Wisconsin, Tony Evers and Tim Mitchells are much more moderate of candidates, while in Pennsylvania, Doug Mastriano is one of the most pro-life candidates that the Republican Party has ever nominated, and his views on abortion are going to be an issue. Right now, Pennsylvania does offer abortion protections, but that could go away if Mastriano is elected and works together with the Republican-controlled legislature to overturn those rights for the citizens of the Keystone State. And so Pennsylvania right now, I do have it as a lean Democratic state. I think obviously Democrats are going to win this race, but I don't think it's going to be anywhere near the margin that 538 currently projects. A 7-point margin for Josh Shapiro is going to be very, very difficult. However, it is still actually worse than what polling may suggest, but polling in Pennsylvania has been known to overestimate Democrats. So Shapiro may lead by 8.2% in the polls and double digits in every single poll that's been released in July, but honestly, he's going to underperform just like Tom Wolf did 4 years ago. And so I think a 3 to 5% margin is much more realistic right here in Pennsylvania for Josh Shapiro. And now before we move on to the races in the West, I'm going to cover the election in Maine between Janet Mills and Paul LePage. Mills is running for her second term. Paul LePage is the former two-term governor, elected in both 2010 and 2014. Now, LePage is one of the best nominees that the GOP has put up this cycle. I think he definitely is an electable candidate, but Maine is also a state that clearly favors the Democratic Party. They've won it in basically all of the last couple of presidential elections going back to the 1980s. And Janet Mills is a pretty popular incumbent. Nothing special, but definitely she does not have any sort of unpopularity that would hinder her chances at a second term. And so if you look at the latest polls for this race, Janet Mills does lead in every single one of them against LePage, but I think that Paul LePage can get within 5%. Polls in Maine have been very all over the place. If you look at the 2018 election, they were not too far off. This last poll did show Mills up by 17%. Of course, she won by 8%, so most of the polls 4 years ago were pretty accurate. However, if you look at another race like the Senate election in Maine in 2020, these were the polls going into the election between Sarah Gideon and Susan Collins, and I'll tell you right now that Susan Collins ended up winning this election by almost double digits. So polls in Maine have been very all over the place, but I think that with Janet Mills right now up in every single one of them, she is still favored, and according to 538, she has an 81% chance of winning. Again, I think that this is a bit too high for Democrats, but on our map, I do have Maine as the third lean Democratic state. And now that we're done with the northeastern half of the country, I'm going to move on to Kansas, which is probably the most interesting race that we have this year. Laura Kelly was elected in 2018. She defeated Chris Kobach, the Republican nominee. It was expected to be a very close election, but Laura Kelly outperformed expectations, definitely winning by a margin of 5%. This was a surprisingly large margin, and in 2022, Laura Kelly is still going to be a pretty formidable candidate, but still, Democrats have not had a good time in this state. Kansas has only voted for Democrats in presidential elections on 3 different occasions in the last 100 years. In the last century, the only 3 times in which Democrats have won Kansas were in 1932 and 1936 under FDR, and most recently in 1964 when Lyndon B. Johnson ran for re-election. And I mean, those were 400, 500 electoral vote landslides for the party. And so in 2022, Laura Kelly is going to be by far the most vulnerable Democrat running, and she probably is going to lose. If you do look at the polls, she is holding on, but honestly, Derek Schmidt is leading here, and with a year like 2022, we're not going to see Laura Kelly once again outperform expectations. Derek Schmidt is probably going to be the next governor of Kansas, and so I do have the state as lean for the Republicans. 538, though, does actually favor Kelly. I think that this is just another one of those cases in which 538 is severely overestimating Democrats. If you look at the numbers here, Laura Kelly has a 53% chance at winning her re-election. Still a toss-up, but definitely way too high for Democrats, even though Democrats are leading in the generic ballot numbers this year. I mean, just look at the numbers in 2018, 8.6 4 years ago, and now 4 years later, Democrats are up by 0.5%. I mean, still a drastic shift, and Democrats leading by 0.5% nationwide is absolutely no sign that they're going to do even close to as well as they did in the previous midterm. And for the remaining 4 races, I'm going to start off with Oregon and move down to New Mexico. So in Oregon, Tina Kotek is running against Christine Drazan. Betsy Johnson, a former Democrat, is running as an independent in this election, and essentially she's playing spoiler to Kotek. In 2018, Kate Brown was narrowly elected to a second term, and honestly, she is one of the most unpopular governors in the entire country, and considering how blue Oregon is, her numbers really are quite abysmal. She did not even win by any sort of impressive margin in 2018, considering how blue of a year it was. I mean, just look at the other elections that we had that year. Illinois was solid for J.B. Pritzker, and he flipped the state with Bruce Rauner running for re-election. Even Gretchen Whitmer won by a larger margin in Michigan, a state that Donald Trump won in 2016, and Oregon voted for Hillary Clinton by almost 15% in that election. So the state of Oregon on the gubernatorial level is much more competitive than it is in both Senate and presidential elections, and that's something that we do see in a lot of states. I mean, we do have Democratic governors in states like Kentucky and Louisiana, but in the Oregon race right now, Tina Kotek is still probably going to end up winning as the Democrat. I think it's almost guaranteed that she becomes the next governor, even though Christine Drazan is going to get pretty close. According to 538, Oregon is actually only a lean state for Democrats, and this is a direct result of the spoiler effect that Betsy Johnson is having on this election. So Oregon right now is going to be lean for Democrats. Obviously a win for the party, but definitely going to be a lot closer than where it should be. Betsy Johnson is not going to win. Independents almost always underperform expectations, so even though she's doing all right in the polls, there's no way that she comes close. In Nevada, we have a race between Joe Lombardo and Steve Sisolak. Sisolak is running for a second term, first elected in 2018 by 4%, and Sisolak is in a good position considering the polls that we have here. According to the Senate polls, Masso is up by 1.5%, but on the governor level, Sisolak leads by 1.9%, so it's a slight difference, but it is clear, according to all the polls that we've seen, that Steve Sisolak is a slightly better candidate, and a 1.9% margin is not terrible for Democrats, but it's also nothing great. I mean, it would be pretty bad if Lombardo was winning in terms of Steve Sisolak's chances at winning a second term, but Democrats have been known to be overestimated in polls for the state of Nevada. In 2020, Joe Biden was up by 5.3% in the state. There was never a point in which Nevada was really even that close. However, Joe Biden in the very end only won by 2.4%. So I do think that we're going to see something like that once again. I think that the election for governor of Nevada is going to be one of the closest ones that we have, but a 1.9% margin honestly is just way too big right now for the Democratic Party. So I do have Nevada as a tilt state for Steve Sisolak. I think that as of this point in time, he does have a very slight edge, but but this race can become very, very competitive. And of course, on top of that, we could always see a Republican flip here. Nevada is going to be one of the most contentious states that we have in the country in all elections, basically, for the next couple of years, as Nevada becomes more and more purple, with Hispanics leaving the Democratic Party. So Nevada right now, I think Democrats have a very slight edge, but it could obviously pretty easily go both ways. Next up in Arizona, we have the race between Kari Lake and Katie Hobbs. Lake narrowly won the Republican primary against Karen Taylor Robson a couple of weeks back. In 2018, Doug Ducey won his re-election by almost a solid margin, but this time around, with Lake as a GOP nominee, we're going to see a much closer race. Lake is a pretty well-known local TV news anchor for Fox in the state. Katie Hobbs is the incumbent Secretary of State, so we have two very different profiles for the candidates. And Kari Lake was the more pro-Trump candidate. She did receive the support of the former president, while Karen Taylor Robson was endorsed by both Mike Pence and Doug Ducey. And so Kari Lake, if you look at the polls between her and Hobbs compared to the polls between Robson and Hobbs, Kari Lake significantly underperforms Robson, and so this is another mistake that the GOP has made. I mean, just the candidates they are choosing simply are the greatest. I mean, if you look at this poll from late June, yes, it was Democratic sponsored, but Lake is down by 9 points while Hobbs is down by 5. I don't believe that Hobbs is going to win by a margin anywhere near 5%, but it clearly shows that Karen Taylor Robson would have been much more electable of a nominee. And so right now, I do have Arizona as being tilted for the Democratic Party. I mean, just like Wisconsin and Nevada, Arizona is going to be one of the closest races, and 530 actually agrees with me on this. They do have the state of Arizona as being a toss-up. However, Katie Hobbs does have a 59% chance of winning. I think this is much more realistic. I think that Hobbs does have a slight advantage, but Kari Lake winning would not be a surprise at all, and the odds have gone up significantly for Democrats over the last couple of months. So Arizona is going to be the 23rd state on our map for the Democratic Party. And finally, in New Mexico, alongside Oregon, this is probably one of the most surprisingly close elections that we have. Michelle Lujan Grisham is running for her re-election. She won by 14 points in 2018 against Steve Pearce, but 2022 is going to be very, very different. Mark Ronchetti is a good nominee for the Republican Party. He came very close to defeating Ben Ray Lujan in 2020 for the Senate seat, much closer than initially expected, and so the Republican Party definitely made a good decision by nominating Ronchetti. Lujan Grisham is one of the most unpopular governors in the entire country, probably the #1 most unpopular Democratic governor, and she's also somebody that does have sexual misconduct allegations against her, and that is going to hurt her going into a re-election campaign. If you look at the polling for this race, on average, RCB has Grisham up by 3.5%, but honestly, that is not where she wants to be. I mean, just 4 years ago, she won by double digits, almost a solid margin in the state of New Mexico. So her victory 4 years ago was very impressive, but I do believe that in 2022, her victory is going to be very, very disappointing for the party. And so I do still have New Mexico as a lean Democratic state. There's no doubt that Grisham is heavily favored here, but definitely a race that Republicans should be targeting a bit more. I think that they could make big gains in the state this year, but a victory at this point in time just seems too out of reach. And so this is where I'm at right now with the governor races. 26-24, Democrats flipping Arizona as well as Massachusetts and Maryland. I do believe still Republicans are going to flip Kansas. If the national environment was more like that of the ones that we had in 2018 and 2020, definitely Laura Kelly would win her re-election, but that's simply not where we're at right now. And so as of this point in time, Democrats are doing much better than they should have been expected to be doing at this point in time just a few months back. Democrats have retaken the lead nationwide, and it is showing in these races. This map actually projects a net gain of 2 governorships for the Democrats after a midterm that should be a red wave year. In 2014, Republicans won 31 governorships, just 18 for Democrats. In 2018, Democrats won 23, 7 flips for the party overall. And then in 2021, Democrats lost Virginia with the election of Glenn Youngkin. So right now, they only hold 22 governorships. So this would be a big win for Democrats if they actually expanded upon the number number of governor's mansions that they controlled, and we're just going to have to see over the next couple of months whether or not the party can continue this momentum. So thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure you like it down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below which party you think will win more governorships. Do you agree with this map? And subscribe to my channel if you haven't. Consider getting a channel membership for just 99 cents per month if you want extra perks on this channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.